Warsaw, 1942. A Polish nurse walked through the gates of the Warsaw Ghetto carrying a toolbox and wearing a yellow Star of David armband. But Irena Sendler wasn't there to treat patients. She was there to smuggle Jewish children to safety. Over the next 3 years, she would save 2,500 children from certain death, using methods so dangerous and creative that even hardened resistance fighters called her crazy. She hid babies in coffins, smuggled toddlers through sewage pipes, and drugged children to keep them quiet while passing German checkpoints. When the Gestapo finally caught her, they tortured her so brutally they broke both her legs and feet. But she never revealed the location of a single child. This incredible story is completely true, every detail verified by historical records and survivor testimonies. If you love hearing about real heroes like this, make sure to subscribe. We share these amazing true stories regularly. What makes Irena's story even more remarkable is that she wasn't part of some large resistance organization with unlimited resources. She was a 32-year-old social worker who decided on her own that she couldn't watch children die while she did nothing to help them. Working mostly alone, with just a few trusted allies, Irena developed an underground network that saved more Jewish children than any other individual rescue operation in Nazi-occupied Europe. She kept detailed records of every child she saved, writing their real names and new identities on pieces of paper that she buried in glass jars in her garden. And when the war ended, Irena dug up those jars and spent years trying to reunite the children with surviving family members. Most of the families were already dead, but Irena never stopped trying to help the children she had saved find their way back to some kind of normal life. Irena Sendler's story begins before the war, in a small town outside Warsaw where she was born in 1910. Her father, Stanis Fejanowski, was a doctor who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. He was one of the few Christians in their community who regularly treated Jewish patients, and he instilled in Irena a deep belief that all human lives had equal value. When Irena was young, her father contracted typhus from one of his patients. On his deathbed, he told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. If you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. Those words would guide Irena through the most dangerous period of her life. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Irena was working as a social worker for the Warsaw Department of Health and Social Services. She was 29 years old, recently married, and living what seemed like a normal life in one of Europe's most vibrant cities. But normal life ended abruptly when German forces occupied Warsaw in September 1939. Almost immediately, the Nazis began implementing policies designed to isolate and persecute Warsaw's Jewish population, which numbered over 350,000 people, about one-third of the city's total population. Jews were required to wear identifying armbands, barred from public parks and transportation, and eventually forced to move into a sealed ghetto that covered only about 2.4% of Warsaw's total area. Over 400,000 people were crammed into this tiny space, living in conditions of unimaginable overcrowding, poverty, and disease. As a city employee, Irena had official access to the ghetto for health inspections and social services. What she saw there horrified her. Families were living 10 or 12 people to a single room. Children were starving in the streets. Disease was rampant, and people were dying by the hundreds every day. But what affected Irena most were the children. She watched as young mothers tried desperately to keep their babies alive on starvation rations. She saw toddlers with the haunted, hollow eyes of people who had seen too much suffering. She witnessed teenagers taking care of younger siblings because their parents had already died of disease or starvation. According to the Nazi regulations that governed Irena's work, she was supposed to inspect conditions in the ghetto and file reports, nothing more. She was explicitly forbidden from providing unauthorized aid to ghetto residents. Irena decided to ignore those regulations completely. She began by smuggling food, medicine, and clothing into the ghetto. She would hide supplies in her official health department bags, or tape them to her body under her clothes. It was dangerous. Being caught smuggling aid to Jews could result in imprisonment or execution. But Irena couldn't stand to watch people starve when she had the means to help them. But food and medicine were just temporary solutions. As conditions in the ghetto deteriorated further, and as rumors began to circulate about mass deportations to unknown destinations in the East, Irena realized that many of the ghetto's residents, especially the children, would not survive unless they could be gotten out completely. That is when Irena began to consider an idea that even she recognized was incredibly dangerous: systematically smuggling Jewish children out of the ghetto and placing them with Christian families who could hide their true identities. The idea was essentially a massive kidnapping operation, except that instead of holding children for ransom, Irena would be stealing them from death and giving them a chance at life. But the logistics were staggering. How do you smuggle thousands of children out of one of the most heavily guarded areas in Nazi-occupied Europe? How do you find Christian families willing to risk their lives to hide Jewish children? And how do you keep track of who went where so that children could potentially be reunited with surviving family members after the war? Irena spent months planning, but the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the operation was not only possible, but necessary. The alternative was to let thousands of children die while she watched helplessly. In early 1942, Irena Sendler decided to become Warsaw's most unlikely criminal. Creating a child smuggling operation in Nazi-occupied Warsaw required Irena to recruit people who were willing to risk their lives on a daily basis for strangers they would probably never meet. She needed drivers who could transport children, families who could hide them, forgers who could create false documents, and informants who could warn of impending raids. What made this even more difficult was that Irena couldn't advertise for help. A single informant or double agent could destroy the entire operation and get everyone involved executed. She had to identify potential allies carefully, approach them discreetly, and somehow convince them to join what was essentially a suicide mission. Irena's first recruit was Stefania Wiczerzyka, a friend who worked with her at the health department. Stefania agreed to help Irena scout potential hiding places for children and to make contact with Christian families who might be willing to take them in. Next came Helena Sizesko, another social worker who had access to the ghetto and could help identify children who most urgently needed to be rescued. Helena also began forging documents, creating false birth certificates, baptismal records, and identity cards that could transform Jewish children into Polish Christians. Gradually, Irena assembled a network of about 20 people who were directly involved in the operation. They included drivers, nurses, teachers, social workers, and ordinary citizens who had decided they couldn't stand by while children were murdered. But finding people willing to help was only the first challenge. The much larger problem was figuring out how to actually get children out of the ghetto without being caught. The Warsaw Ghetto was surrounded by a 10-foot high wall topped with broken glass and barbed wire. German guards manned all the official checkpoints, and anyone entering or leaving the ghetto was subject to search. Getting caught smuggling a Jewish child out of the ghetto would result in immediate execution for both Irena and the child. Irena's solution was to use her official position as a health department employee to gain regular access to the ghetto, then use increasingly creative methods to hide children during her exits. Her first successful rescue involved a 6-month-old baby who was critically ill and needed medical treatment that wasn't available in the ghetto. Irena wrapped the baby in blankets and placed her in the bottom of her medical bag, underneath a layer of official documents. She then walked calmly through the checkpoint, gambling that the guards would be too busy or too lazy to conduct a thorough search of her bag. The plan worked, but Irena realized she couldn't rely on luck indefinitely. She needed more sophisticated methods if she was going to save large numbers of children. Over the next few months, Irena developed an arsenal of smuggling techniques that became legendary among Warsaw's resistance fighters. She hid small children in coffins during fake funeral processions, with the children drugged to keep them unconscious and silent. She smuggled toddlers through sewage pipes that connected the ghetto to the outside city. She concealed babies in toolboxes, laundry bags, and even in the back of garbage trucks. One of her most frequently used methods involved St. Mary's Hospital, which was located near the ghetto wall. Irena would arrange for children to die in the hospital, complete with fake death certificates. The children would then be loaded into coffins and carried out through the ghetto cemetery gate for burial in the Christian cemetery. Once safely outside the ghetto, the coffins would be opened, and the very much alive children would be taken to their new hiding places. But perhaps Irena's most audacious method involved the Warsaw courthouse, which had an entrance inside the ghetto and an exit on the outside. Irena would bring children into the courthouse as if they were there for legal proceedings, then walk them out the other side. The children would be wearing clothes that made them look like they belonged with Irena, and she would coach them on how to act natural while walking past German guards. Each rescue operation required weeks of planning. Irena had to identify children whose parents were willing to give them up, find families willing to hide them, create false documents, and coordinate all the logistics of getting children from point A to point B without being detected. But the most difficult part of the operation wasn't the smuggling itself. It was convincing Jewish parents to give up their children. Many parents were understandably reluctant to trust a stranger with their most precious possessions. They knew that if they gave their children to Irena, they might never see them again. They also knew that if Irena was caught or if she turned out to be a Nazi agent, their children would be killed. Irena had to build trust with families who had every reason to be suspicious of outsiders. She did this by starting small smuggling food and medicine to prove her good intentions, then gradually building relationships that allowed her to discuss the possibility of rescuing children. Even then, many parents refused to give up their children until it was almost too late. Irena often found herself arguing with parents who insisted that families should stay together no matter what, even if staying together meant dying together. These conversations were heartbreaking for everyone involved. Parents would hold their children and cry, knowing that sending them away might be the only way to save their lives, but also knowing that they were probably seeing their children for the last time. But Irena persisted because she understood something that many of the parents couldn't yet see. The Warsaw Ghetto was a death trap, and children who stayed there had virtually no chance of survival. By the spring of 1943, Irena Sendler had established one of the most successful rescue operations in Nazi-occupied Europe. She was smuggling an average of 10 to 15 children per week out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and her network had successfully placed hundreds of Jewish children with Christian families throughout Poland. But success brought new challenges. As the number of rescued children grew, so did the complexity of keeping track of them. Irena faced a problem that would have stumped most people. How do you maintain detailed records of a highly illegal operation without creating evidence that could get everyone involved killed? Irena's solution was both simple and brilliant. She wrote down the real name, age, and family information of every child she rescued, along with details about where they had been placed and what their new identity was. She wrote this information in tiny handwriting on small pieces of paper, which she then sealed in glass jars and buried in her garden. This record-keeping system served two crucial purposes. First, it allowed Irena to keep track of where children were placed, so she could check on their welfare and move them if their hiding places became unsafe. Second, it preserved the possibility that children could eventually be reunited with surviving family members after the war. Irena was one of the few resistance operatives who understood that rescuing children was only half the job. The other half was preserving their identities and family connections so that they could reclaim their true selves when it was safe to do so. But maintaining these records required incredible courage. Every jar buried in Irena's garden contained enough information to get hundreds of people killed. If the Gestapo ever discovered her record-keeping system, they would have a complete map of her entire operation. By late 1943, Irena was living with a constant knowledge that she was one unlucky break away from disaster. She had rescued over 2,000 children by this point, and her network had grown large enough to attract attention from German intelligence services. The Gestapo had noticed that too many Jewish children seemed to be disappearing from the ghetto. They knew that someone was running a systematic smuggling operation, and they were determined to find out who. Irena tried to stay ahead of the investigation by constantly changing her methods and varying her routines. She never used the same smuggling route twice in a row. She never met with the same contacts in the same locations. She created false identities for herself and moved frequently between different safe houses. But the Gestapo was patient and thorough. They began conducting surveillance of everyone who had regular access to the ghetto. They interrogated captured resistance fighters, hoping to extract information about smuggling operations. They offered rewards to informants who could provide information about illegal activities. On the 20th of October 1943, Irena's luck finally ran out. Gestapo agents arrested her at her apartment in Warsaw. They had been watching her for weeks and had finally gathered enough evidence to justify taking her into custody. What followed was one of the most brutal interrogation campaigns in the history of Nazi-occupied Warsaw. The Gestapo was convinced that Irena was the leader of the child smuggling operation, and they were determined to extract from her the names of her accomplices and the locations where children had been hidden. For weeks, Gestapo interrogators tortured Irena in ways that were designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping her conscious and able to answer questions. They broke both of her legs and both of her feet. They beat her with clubs and whips. They applied electrical shocks to sensitive areas of her body. But Irena never revealed a single name or location. She never admitted to smuggling children. She never provided any information that could have been used to harm the people who had trusted her with their lives. The Gestapo couldn't understand how a 33-year-old social worker could withstand torture that had broken hardened resistance fighters and career criminals. They brought in specialist interrogators from Berlin. They tried different torture methods. They threatened to arrest her family members. Nothing worked. Irena had made a decision that she would rather die than betray the children she had rescued or the people who had helped her rescue them. After weeks of torture, the Gestapo finally gave up on getting information from Irena. They sentenced her to death and scheduled her execution for early 1944. But Irena's story wasn't over. Her network of allies was about to prove that they were just as committed to protecting her as she had been to protecting the children. Irena Sendler was scheduled to be executed in January 1944, but she never made it to the execution grounds. On the morning she was supposed to die, Gestapo guards found her cell empty. Somehow, despite being barely able to walk due to her torture injuries, Irena had vanished from one of Warsaw's most secure prisons. What had actually happened was that Ghetto, the Polish resistance organization that helped rescue Jews, had bribed Gestapo guards to allow Irena to escape. The bribe was enormous, more money than most people earned in several years. But Ghetto considered Irena too valuable to lose. But Irena's escape came at a tremendous cost. Her legs and feet had been so badly damaged by torture that she would never walk normally again. She was in constant pain and required months of medical treatment just to survive her injuries. More importantly, her escape meant that she could no longer operate openly in Warsaw. The Gestapo was furiously searching for her, and anyone caught helping her would be executed immediately. Irena had to go into deep hiding, living in safe houses and constantly moving to stay ahead of German search parties. This forced retirement was devastating for Irena, because she knew that children were still dying in the ghetto while she was unable to help them. But her network continued operating without her, using the methods and contacts she had established to rescue as many children as possible before the ghetto was finally liquidated. In April and May 1944, German forces systematically destroyed what remained of the Warsaw Ghetto, killing most of the remaining residents and burning the area to the ground. By that point, Irena's network had rescued approximately 2,500 Jewish children, more than any other individual rescue operation during the Holocaust. But for Irena, the end of the war didn't mean the end of her work. In fact, in some ways, her most important work was just beginning. In 1945, as Poland began to recover from 6 years of Nazi occupation, Irena dug up the glass jars she had buried in her garden. Each jar contained detailed information about dozens of children, their real names, their family information, where they had been placed, and what their false identities were. Irena's goal was to reunite as many children as possible with surviving family members. She spent countless hours tracking down the families of rescued children, hoping to find parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or siblings who had somehow survived the war. But this reunion work was heartbreaking in ways that Irena hadn't anticipated. The vast majority of the Jewish families from the Warsaw Ghetto had been murdered during the Holocaust. Most of the children Irena had rescued were now orphans, with no surviving family members to return to. Even more difficult was the fact that many of the rescued children had no memory of their original identities. Children who had been very young when they were rescued had completely adapted to their false identities and considered their Christian foster families to be their real families. Some children refused to believe that they were Jewish. Others were terrified of being taken away from the only families they remembered. A few were angry at Irena for disrupting the lives they had built with their foster families. Irena found herself caught between competing claims on the children she had rescued. Jewish organizations wanted to reclaim Jewish children and help them emigrate to Palestine or other countries where they could live openly as Jews. Christian families who had risked their lives to hide children often wanted to keep them permanently, and the children themselves sometimes wanted to stay with their foster families rather than reconnect with their Jewish heritage. These disputes were legally and emotionally complex, and there were no easy answers. Irena tried to respect the wishes of the children while also honoring the sacrifices their original parents had made in giving them up. Over the years following the war, Irena was able to reunite about 500 children with surviving relatives. The other 2,000 children either chose to remain with their foster families, emigrated to Israel or other countries, or simply disappeared into post-war Poland with their new identities. For many people, successfully rescuing 2,500 children from the Holocaust would have been enough for a lifetime of heroism. But Irena was haunted by the children she hadn't been able to save. She often said that her greatest regret was not doing more, not starting sooner, not finding a way to rescue even more children. Irena lived quietly in post-war Poland, working as a nurse and social worker, and rarely talking about her wartime activities. For decades, her story was largely unknown outside of Poland, partly because the communist government didn't want to publicize stories that might make ordinary Poles look heroic compared to party officials. It wasn't until the 1990s that Irena's story began to receive international attention. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She didn't win, but the nomination brought her story to a global audience. When Irena Sendler died in 2008 at the age of 98, she was finally recognized as one of the great heroes of the Holocaust. But even in her final years, she insisted that she didn't deserve special recognition for doing what any decent person should have done. "I was brought up to believe that a person must be rescued when drowning, regardless of religion and nationality," she said in one of her last interviews. The term hero irritates me greatly. The opposite is true. I continue to have qualms of conscience that I did so little. Irena Sendler's story reminds us that heroism isn't about dramatic gestures or impossible feats of strength. Sometimes heroism is about making a simple decision, that you cannot stand by and watch innocent people suffer when you have the power to help them. Irena's rescue of 2,500 children stands as one of the most remarkable individual achievements of the entire Holocaust period. But what makes her story even more inspiring is her humility about what she had accomplished. She never considered herself a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. Her story also shows us the importance of preparation and record, keeping even in the most dangerous circumstances. By carefully documenting every child she rescued, Irena gave those children a chance to reclaim their identities and family connections after the war ended. Most importantly, Irena's story demonstrates that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they decide that some things are more important than their own safety and comfort. What do you think motivated Irena to risk her life for children she had never met? Was it her father's teachings, her religious beliefs, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, subscribe for more incredible tales of courage and compassion from history's darkest periods. Remember Irena Sendler's example. When you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look away.